Welcome to today's TAFETalks. I'm Teresa Schmidt, the Director of Policy and Governance at TAFE Directors Australia. Today's topic is navigating assessment and integrity in the age of AI. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the different lands upon which we meet. I'm coming to you from Gubbi Gubbi country, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us in the discussion today. If you would like to introduce yourself and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that you are on, please feel free to do so in the chat. But I'll say Wanya, welcome to you all. In today's session, we will explore the evolving impact of generative AI on integrity and assessment. It's a bit of a hot topic, judging by the number of people joining us today. I'm going to begin by introducing our speakers. Firstly, we have Dr. Lenka Ucnik, TEQSA's Director of Higher Education Integrity Unit. Lenka has over 15 years of experience working in the higher education sector. As the Acting Director of the Higher Education Integrity Unit, she's been actively involved in the team's work around GenAI to provide support and guidance and to facilitate sector-wide uplift. Welcome, Lenka. Next, we have Dr. Hayden Park, a lecturer in education at Melbourne Polytechnic, whose research interests centre around STEM and science education and the use of technology in learning, particularly in artificial intelligence and extended reality technologies. So Dr. Park also maintains a keen interest in all aspects of behaviour support within educational settings. His PhD focused on the use of virtual reality to help pre-service teachers learn about school-wide positive behaviour support, while his current research relates to the integration of generative AI into educational contexts. Welcome, Hayden. Joining Hayden from Melbourne Polytechnic is Dr. Elly Thomson, the Head of Program for the Suite of Education degrees at Melbourne Polytechnic. With a rich background spanning kindergarten, primary and higher education, Elly's work is dedicated to advancing early childhood education. Her teaching and research focus on building collaborative partnerships with families, integrating new technologies, and ensuring the provision of high-quality initial teacher education. Elly also contributes to national education policy and accreditation through her work with regulatory and professional bodies. So we have a great lineup of speakers for you today. But before I hand over to Lenka from TEQSA to kick us off, I wanted to let you know that today's session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to everyone who registered for this TAFETalks event and on the TDA website. Closed captioning is also available. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to our speakers today, please use the Q&A box throughout the session. We'll come back to those at the end, and there might be some opportunity for our speakers to answer some of those by typing into the Q&A box. So get your questions into the Q&A box. You might use the chat for discussion during the session, but it's a bit difficult for us to monitor that chat for questions, particularly with so many of you in here today. So please use the Q&A function. It now gives me great pleasure to hand over to Lenka to kick off today's discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Teresa. It's really great to be here today. I'm joining you from the land of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. I'd just like to, before I share my slides, I'd like to sort of preface this with, because I'm coming from the higher education regulator, of course, my focus is going to be on assurances of learning and risks to assessment integrity. However, I'm also really aware that there's a lot of amazing work that's happening by assessment designers, teaching and learning staff, and various professional staff at all sorts of tertiary education providers using this technology to really enhance the learning experience and really enrich student experiences. So I just wanted to say that because we're often accused of, but what about the benefits? I'm totally aware of the benefits, but we're the grumpy regulator, so I have to talk about the risks. And the other thing I just wanted to sort of apologize if it happens is I've had a bit of a chest infection. So if I start to sound like I've been running a marathon halfway through, I'm just foreshadowing it now so it doesn't seem weird, but I think I'll be okay. Anyway, so I'll share my slides now. And they worked perfectly a second ago. So let's see if I can capture the magic again. Okay, hang on a second. I think there we go. Hopefully that's working. Fantastic. So, what I am going to talk about today, before I reveal my slides, is basically I'm going to sort of discuss really kind of high level sort of landscape of where we sit in relation to Gen AI more broadly, where we sit in relation to TEQSA's regulatory obligations, and then also just general advice that we've been giving to the sector over the last couple of years on the things that they really need to consider when you know assessing the risk to their courses and assessment design. And then at the end, I'm going to do a shameless plug on some of the resources that we've developed over the years. And I have to confess that a lot of actually pretty much all of them are the high quality that they are because we really engaged with the sector on these. They were not developed in isolation by my team. They were developed in consultation with lots of experts throughout Australia. So, one thing that I just wanted to kind of flag is, hopefully most of you in some way are at least vaguely familiar with TEQSA. So, TEQSA is the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency. Even though the word tertiary is in our title, we are basically the higher education regulator. And our purpose is really to deliver quality assurances that protect the interests of students and also the reputation and standing of Australian higher education. And we do this in so TEQSA predominantly is a regulator and they look at risks at a provider level, whereas our team is kind of tasked with looking at sector-wide risks, hence we've been doing a lot of the work on Gen AI. However, the three kind of broad categories that I think a lot of the work throughout the agency can sort of fall into is monitoring compliance with our standards framework and the ESOS framework, identifying and assessing risks to the sector, and sharing information, guidance, and best practice. Relating to our actual work around Gen AI, I have to say the second 2 points were really central. So we do a lot of sort of horizon scanning activities to just sort of see kind of changes in things, whether it's an emerging risk or an evolving risk. And even prior to November 2022, we'd actually put out a few just pretty low level messages, maybe but from the Chief Commissioner's letter to the sector or something like that, saying, we're noticing that this technology is developing and evolving, and providers should kind of make sure that they've got, the appropriate policies and procedures in place to address this emerging technology. But even at that stage, we were still really framing it in the context of academic integrity, much like our work in the contract cheating space. So making sure that it's there, whereas as we all know now, it's far more wide spanning than just students cheating. And then once ChatGPT kind of was launched and we all ran around with our hands in the air for about a few months, we really started to work closely with the sector to share information, guidance. Recently, as a result of the RFI, which I'll talk about a bit later, we also kind of shared a lot of emerging practices that are happening within different institutions, not just universities, but providers of all shapes and sizes. So I think it's really important to sort of be mindful, and it's really obvious when I say it, but sometimes the obvious things are the ones that I quite frequently forget, is that kind of AI and the regulation of AI is not just a problem of Australian tertiary education. It sits in a far broader context. And I think that's really important as well. Particularly the first point is a really important one for students to be made aware of. It's easy to assume that they kind of know what it is, but sometimes we can sort of, assume a base level of understanding that's not really there. So, in the context of global platforms, AI is a global sector and it has a lot of vested interest and it's creating amazing tools that can do amazing things. But for the most part, they don't really care about us, they don't have good intentions about us. They're just developing these things for various reasons, including data collection. So I think it's really important to educate our students about this broader context so that when they do use not just the approved sort of tools of your institution, but just tools in general, they're doing that knowingly. So they can actually make the judgments with an informed way, not just using things completely unaware of what they're doing, how they're using it, what the risks might be, not just in terms of data sharing, but in terms of also the content that's generated. The second thing is also kind of recognizing, and this was mentioned a little bit when Teresa was introducing the speakers, that tertiary education is just one part of a much broader educational landscape. Obviously, there is all of the education our students do before they hit vocational or higher education. And they've already developed a bunch of habits and ways of working and engaging with AI and other things so that when they land at our institutions, they're not coming in as blank slates. And also, tertiary education isn't the only field grappling with generative AI. Uh, Maybe about a month ago, we held a webinar with National AI Centre and Jobs and Skills Australia. And one thing that was interesting, particularly from the Jobs Skills Australia presentation, is that a lot of the problems we're grappling with in the tertiary education sector are kind of actually the same as they're seeing in industry. So there's what the industry says that they are using Gen AI for and how, and then the actual reality of it. And the two are actually a little bit at a mismatch. And I kind of, in a weird way, I found that even though it's not great, I found it heartening because it's like, oh, okay, it's not just us who are having a problem. And I think there's a report coming out sort of in the next month or two, which I'm assuming will kind of discuss that sort of stuff in more detail. Then, of course, there's the idea that we've already probably got quite a bit of existing legislation that can kind of help us mitigate some of the risks that this emerging technology presents to us. There is some legislation that definitely needs to be updated, but then there is some that we can kind of, hang our hat on for the time being to provide a foundation of how we kind of look at certain problems and issues. And now, coming from TEQSA, drum roll please, of course, I'm going to refer to the Higher Education Standards Framework. So this is the one that we're really relying on when we are advising our regulated providers on how to kind of engage with the risks and opportunities this generative AI presents. The Higher Education Standards Framework is really principles based, which kind of is a good and a problematic thing to some degree. So because it's principles based, it's really kind of easy to identify areas where certain things can fall under. So we have which will be in the next slide, but we have a bit in the standards framework that students need to demonstrate the learning outcomes of their award. Now, when this was written, this was way before generative AI ever came in, but we can apply that principle to this emerging technology. However, because it is a principle, it's always open to interpretation. And in times like this, where there's so much flux and change and uncertainty, sometimes people actually just want an instruction manual to say, look, tell me what I can do, tell me how to use it, tell me when to use it. And unfortunately, the principles don't do that, and nor should they, to be honest. So, some of the key messages that we've been saying over the last 2 years. So everyone started with how do we know our students are cheating? And we very quickly in Australia in particular evolved to kind of looking at this in a far more kind of nuanced and holistic way. I have to say, it might be different now. So, this was last year, sort of around this time, and things changed quickly. But I was surprised when going to some international things in North America and even Europe, a lot of the conversations were still kind of reflective of the conversations we were having in early 2023 around this kind of cheating thing rather than moving into assessment integrity and assurances of learning outcomes. But that might have been different now. So, take that with a grain of salt. So, a lot of the relevant standards, and there's more, but these are kind of the really key ones that we're sort of hanging everything else off on, is that whatever kind of assessment you have, like we're not prescribing what that is, and it's going to be really different depending on the course of study, right? So whether you're doing a humanities award to a nursing degree to an IT degree, the forms of assessment are going to be different, and certain things are going to need to be adjusted more than others. But at the end, the gist is that whatever that assessment is, it's actually capable of confirming that all the learning outcomes were actually achieved and that the grade that the student was rewarded reflects the level of that students' attainment. So when they do get that piece of paper at the end of their diploma or their degree or whatever, providers can be confident that they have actually attained the relevant skills and knowledge. And this becomes a bit tricky once we get technology where it can create a lot of things. So, particularly in the higher education space, a lot of, or actually any kind of discipline where there's not a huge practical component. The problem is that often the learning was quite opaque. So students would submit an object, whether that's an essay or a project or a proposal, and then whatever grade they got, that was supposed to demonstrate the learning that they achieved in order to create that. Whereas if something can actually create that now, how are we 100% certain, or even 90% certain, or even 80% certain? I don't want to get much lower than that, that, they have actually learned what they need to learn. The next one is that when providers look at their suite of assessments and their suite of courses, and they do identify some risks to academic integrity or the integrity of assessment methods, or whether they can actually genuinely have assurances about the learning outcomes, what are they doing to mitigate those risks? So it's one thing to go, oh, this is possibly a little bit kind of uncertain whether the students are demonstrating the learning outcomes, to actually doing something to transform that. And that's going to be different for different providers. It's going to be different for different student cohorts. It's going to be different depending on what you offer. Some, like I recall in some providers who are like really small and have, 10 students in a class, and the teacher has them for a whole year and they know them really intimately. Maybe an essay at the end of that year isn't quite as high risk as a wholly online course with, 200 students where there's no way the lecturer is ever going to know anyone. Also, that students are only awarded a degree when they have actually demonstrated the achievement of those learning outcomes. And this, of course, links to the two previous ones. And finally, that there are some kind of oversights that assure that the quality of teaching and learning is being maintained, and that there are ways of monitoring of potential risks, and also ways of monitoring whether your interventions are working. So in 2023, we got together a bunch of people who were way smarter than me to come up with the assessment reform principles. And this was really kind of like a compass to what people can sort of think of in relation to assessment. So it wasn't telling people what they need to do, it was kind of giving a broad overview of some principles to think about. And so one is that the assessments and learning experience actually provide students with the necessary skills to ethically and actively participate in a society where Gen AI is prevalent. And the second one is that there's a way of forming trustworthy judgments about student learning. So, and this can become, inclusive and contextualized approaches to assessment. This year, possibly in about a month or so, we're having a companion piece to this come out, which is developed by the same people. And where this was a compass, the next one is kind of more like a map, to stick with the overly strained metaphors. And they're kind of looking at kind of three different pathways that providers have taken to kind of maintain assurances of assessments. One is basically the kind of programmatic assessment, with which this document sort of talks about. One is kind of securing things at a unit level, and one is sort of like this kind of hybrid kind of approach, which a lot of providers seem to be taking, because certain courses lend themselves more readily to programmatic assessments than others, which, if you think about, isn't a wild thing to say. So the thing that we really want to do as well, apart from ensuring that students are meeting their necessary skills, is that we want to make sure that they do become effective users of this technology. Of course, what they need to do is going to differ between whatever, disciplines and what they're going to be moving into once they graduate. But even lower level kind of, users like myself still need to kind of know what effective and appropriate use is. What we're really worried about is that we're going to be releasing students who think they know what they're doing because, they've engaged with chatbots for a long time, but actually they're probably ineffective and inappropriate users. Of course, we're also not encouraging appropriate and ineffective, and effective but appropriate. I have to confess, the top one that says effective but inappropriate was the same color as the appropriate but ineffective, until someone pointed out, but what about people who are using it to do deep fakes and things like that? Perhaps it should be a little bit more kind of a higher level risk. So I changed the box there. So this is something that I kind of picked up from the KPMG/Uni of Melbourne report that came out earlier this year, and it was just a bit of a global insights sort of into Gen AI use. And interestingly, Australia is one of the lowest levels of engagement with this. And also in the report, there's a lot of distrust and kind of skepticism about the technology. Um, Regarding sort of formal training and education, whether that's through your workplace or kind of self education through something, Australia is only at 24%, whereas globally the average is 39. Interestingly, though, the same report says that 48% of Australians feel they can use AI effectively, but also 36 feel they have the skills to use AI. So I always find these kinds of surveys interesting because I guess if you can't see the exact question, you're like, so only 24 have taken training, but 48 feel they're great, but only 36 think they know how to use it appropriately. So it's all a little bit. But the point is that definitely we need to focus a little bit more on training and education. So, what can we do in this space? So, providers need to support the development and ethical use of to create these, ethical and effective users. Sorry, I stumbled across my words. So, regarding the students, that's the one with the little graduation hat there. Have courses and programs that set up to support student success in their chosen field, and that will include also kind of knowing what they're going into. So, early graduates of 10 years ago might have a very different experience in those entry level jobs to today, depending on what field they're going into. For example, if you did a copy editing course, a lot of what you would do now is probably going to be automated by Gen AI. So you need to kind of train students so they're not coming in expecting to do that work when that work no longer exists. And then industry and employers are frustrated that the students don't have the necessary skills. Also, to make sure that all students entering your environment receive the necessary training. Don't assume a baseline of understanding. And the same goes for staff. So if we're expecting staff to be teaching this, we should also be taking the time to allow staff to actually become familiar with this, become confident in this, understand the emerging technologies that may be being used or may impact their industries. And also, a really important one is the last one, which is making sure that your institutional decision makers are actually informed and up to date on what this technology can do. They can't be expected to make decisions on something that they don't really know the impact of. So I can see the time now, so I'm just going to whoosh by for a couple of slides. I was going to sort of talk about this stuff, but it's basically just taken from the AI toolkit that we released last year. But the idea is that these were sort of three areas that all institutions should sort of think about, and then we kind of break it down. So the process one covers all of those self-assurance measures, such as strategy, risk management, oversights, reporting measures. The people one is all of the professional development for staff and students, the support, also engagement with external partners, and the practice part is relating to the teaching, learning, and assessment activities. I won't go into those now because I'm really aware of the time, but if you are interested, I will provide a link with my shameless plug at the end. Now, my final thing that I'm going to sort of leave you on before I sort of wrap up is that in this kind of very fast paced, changing world with rapidly evolving technologies, today it's Gen AI, who knows what it'll be in 10 years. There are certain things that seem to constantly repeat themselves. One is about the need to develop core competencies, you know, critical thinkers, soft skills. The ability to kind of problem solve, all of these sorts of things seem to constantly come up, both from educators but also from industry. They're not saying we want a student who knows how to engage with a chatbot. They're saying we want a student who is able to adapt and change and use their skills in a changing environment. Also, it's really important to evaluate the learning outcomes. Like, are the learning outcomes that we're asking students to attain still fit for purpose? A lot of them will be, but some might need to change just to adapt to this changing world and also the expectations from employers. And I've sort of mentioned the changing expectations for entry level jobs earlier when I did that copy editing amazing example. So I'll skip over that one. So, just really quickly, my shameless plug, and these are all kind of apart from the letters from the commissioner, um, these are all available on our Gen AI hub, which I'll put the link in. But basically, this is pretty much the body of work that we've done over the last sort of 2.5 years. We've also got that companion piece to the assessment reform principles coming out in a month or two. We're also holding a series of workshops in August to help providers kind of refine and develop their AI action plans, which they submitted last year for the RFI. And we're also going to have a pre-conference workshop this year. However, unfortunately for us, because I quite enjoy working with the sector to do these things, TEQSA is kind of moving into a more regulatory approach as of next year. So we're also working with the RegOps teams to ensure kind of a seamless transition. And they're going to be focusing on all of those learning outcomes and the standards frameworks that I mentioned before. So I'll skip this last one. Oh, actually, the last one I think is kind of interesting, the potential impact from parliamentary reviews. So one thing that happened is from the parliamentary review on the impact of GenAI is that their recommendation 22 particularly said that universities and TAFEs embed GenAI competencies and skills across all courses and degrees. So that one's kind of an interesting one that I guess we'll continue to have to grapple with. But anyway, that's it for me for now. Thank you very much. I will take questions at the end and I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Lenka. So much to think about in that presentation. And yes, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions. Now, I'm going to hand over to Hayden and Elly from Melbourne Polytechnic, who are also going to share with us some very interesting findings about GenAI.
Thanks, Teresa.
Thanks.
Seeing a lot of applause go out there for Lenka. Thanks for that. Great work. Because, yeah, this space, it needs a lot of input because there's a lot going on. So I'll just double check that that is being shared. All good?
Just need to click there we go. Thank you, Hayden.
All good? Fantastic. We will take it away then. And just another plug on a really specific framework. If you're sitting there thinking, what are the resources out there to help me build my assessment security? The two-lane approach by Danny Liu from the University of Sydney is outstanding, and it features in TEQSA's latest report on GenAI strategies, and it is the best one that I've seen. So, feedback. We have looked, Elly and myself and another two colleagues, specifically at the assessment lens of AI. And there we go. We've moved across. So, why might you use GenAI to give feedback? Well, there's a lot of good reasons. The first one being it's going to reduce your workload. I'm sure it doesn't take a huge amount of imagination to see how this is the case. It's literally just asking somebody else to do it for you, and it does it. Snap of a finger. Does it do it well, though? That is the real question. And are there other considerations around it? Some other reasons that you might want to do it. Well, you can give more feedback to a student, and you can give more detailed and personalised feedback than current time allowances allow. So, general rule of thumb in the higher ed TAFE sectors, you got about 1 hour across a semester to give your expert eye feedback to a specific student. And sometimes you've got quite a bit of content to read through, and so you just don't have a huge amount of time. AI can give them a huge volume and much more granular feedback than you might be able to offer them. There's also this dimension of perceived consistency of judgment, which there is something about a robot giving you feedback that you may feel like it is a little bit less biased, even though that may not be a reality. And students often also perceive it as having less risk. They don't feel as judged when they're having their content assessed by something that doesn't exist, which makes a lot of sense in many ways. Some other things that you may want to consider when thinking about this space. You, as someone who may have expert knowledge on a subject, can be placed into a more curatorial role. So this is the idea that not having to give certain kinds of feedback frees you up to give more specific high-level feedback that's really targeted at the student's point of need. And there's also the flip side. If you don't have to do all of this fine-grained marking and it's getting done for you, it may free you up to improve teaching and learning in other areas and spaces. So there is some potential very, very significant gains in this space. So yes, we've heard a lot about the risks, and fairly. They're real, and assessment security is coming under fire, but there is also some very significant potential gains in this space. But as we discovered during our research, it was not all smooth sailing by any stretch of the imagination. And I'll just hand you over to Elly now, who's going to give you a brief overview of what we looked at and what we found.
Great, thanks, Hayden. I'll just talk through our study and what we actually did. So we invited our first year pre-service teachers to be part of the research. We wanted to look at what happens when you do actually use GenAI to produce the feedback, to do your marking we've all dreamed of, just get someone else do it. So we had 15 first-year students who volunteered to take part, and we used a well-established subject that we'd taught for many years and a really experienced human grader. And what we actually did was used the GenAI. We put the de-identified, very important, the de-identified student work through GenAI after it had been marked by a human marker. So we had both pieces. We had the human marked feedback and we had the GenAI feedback, and we looked at the quality dimensions of the feedback. So things like the accuracy, the grade that it was assigned, the actionability of that feedback for students. And then what we did was actually gave both pieces of feedback to the students and surveyed them about their perceptions of the value of the feedback in terms of those quality dimensions. Next slide, thanks, Hayden.
There's a little bit of a lag on the slide control.
That's okay, that's all right. We'll get there. So the next...
Will we?
There we go. So our first finding when we did all of this, and you'll see there the human grades. We had some not satisfactories and some passes, credit, distinction, and high distinction. And then if you take a look at the ChatGPT marked assessments, same assessments went through, you'll see that there was a really big grade inflation. So ChatGPT was far more generous than our human marker. So our human marker said things like it lacks critical analysis and insufficient referencing. And ChatGPT, for the same piece of assessment, said it demonstrates strong understanding and thorough analysis. So exactly the same piece of work and the two different pieces of feedback, as well as the grade inflation. Now, next one. The second finding we found was the praise paradox. So the AI feedback was uniformly positive and encouraging, which was great. You want feedback to be positive and encouraging, but students perceived it as counterproductive to their learning. So they didn't necessarily like that kind of feedback. And some of the findings in analysing the quotes that came back from students was actually more about their relationships and their teacher knowing them, rather than simply looking at the quality, the content of the feedback. So learning shouldn't be about flattery, should be about growth. And that's from one of our first year students. And how will anyone really learn if feedback is always positive? And really important, they pointed out, quite vague. So some of the feedback was positive but vague, which means it's not particularly actionable for students. And now next one, and what the students really think. So this was probably the most interesting part. I thought we'd probably have different findings. All of our students preferred the human feedback rather than the GenAI feedback. And that's really saying something, because I had the ethical dilemma of the human had actually failed the student and GenAI had given the student a distinction or a high distinction. And we gave both pieces back to the student. I must say there was a time that I'm like, oh, I don't know why I'm doing this. This is going to cause me a lot of pain. But the students were really good because they'd volunteered to be part of it and they understood that it was an experiment, to really see what AI could do. So the mismatch was really about positive feedback and not really actionable feedback. And I loved too that students pointed out that their teacher knew them. There was a historical value to the human marker because they knew not only the student, but they really knew the content in early childhood. So this essay was looking at early childhood. So a student who failed and got feedback that pointed out their errors still preferred the human marker rather than the GenAI feedback that told them how wonderful they were, and a pass. We did have one who questioned, which one do I look at? Which one is real? And so again, that points back to things Lenka was talking about in AI literacy and our students understanding that AI is not always right and not all that reliable in terms of their feedback and grades. And Hayden, am I back to you?
I think
Yeah.
there's kind of both of us. What a great little transition slide. Yeah, relationships improve feedback. It's real. It's just one of those dimensions. If you've got the rapport with your students, they're just more likely to take on board the content that you deliver them. So with that in mind, we're just going to raise a few little counterpoints here, because this could be an issue with our use of AI. It could be something that's not inherent to AI. It could be something that's not inherent even to this model of AI or this iteration of this model. So our AI literacy is something that needs to be called into question here. And these results are very time-stamped. So we might find ourselves in 3 or 4 years looking back on this thinking, whoa, that was an early iteration and AI has come streets from where we once were. Or we might find that we've got the exact same problems and issues. So it's just something to keep in mind regarding such an uncertain space, that how you are able to prompt engineer or AI wrangle your particular large language model has a huge impact over your capacity to assess a student accurately and provide them really valuable feedback. So some practical recommendations, very broadly placed into 3 categories. The first is, if you're going to give feedback, you want to be as feedback literate as you possibly can. So knowing yourself how to give really good feedback and knowing the principles behind it. So we're talking about answering like the 3 seminal questions of where's the student at, where are they going, and how are they going to get there. Making sure our feedback is supportive, positive, and if optionable, if able, strength-based is also really valuable. And second to that, having clarity of purpose. Why are you giving them feedback? Are you trying to correct a mistake? Are you trying to give them their next steps? Are you trying to help them build their professional identity? There are so many reasons why you can give feedback, and unless you are clear on your purpose, you're not going to be effective in how you deliver it. Our second broad category for recommendations is being generative AI literate. This one's pretty clear, but also really hard. We want the basics at least. So you want to know how it works, you want to know its strengths, you want to know its limitations, and you want to know how to use it. If you don't know those things, you are not at the starting point of AI literacy. When we get a little bit more advanced, then we're thinking about, okay, you know how to use it, you know the strengths and limitations, then we can move on to what does our institute's policy say about this. If they say don't use it, you can't use it. And finally, just something a little bit more specific, if you're going to use it, make sure you de-identify the paper, because this is something that, yeah, you're going to see all the time in the howler space of the internet. And our third category was being ethical. So making sure that when we're using it at the start, we're using it for really low stakes assessment or just formative feedback. We're not using it for any important form of judgment on learning. That's a space that's reserved for humans at the moment. We also want to be really transparent if you are using it with your students. You would expect the same from your students. If they were using it, you would want them to acknowledge it. I think we need to all get on the same page with this. We want to boost transparency and accountability as much as we possibly can. And the last point, be the expert in the loop. Just because AI said it, don't mean it's right. Not by a long shot. And if you are not an expert on the subject matter, you are not going to be able to help AI help you, because it's got a raft of problems still. And whilst it's getting better, it's still got a long way to go. So be the expert in the loop, team. And I think that's it for us. Elly, is there anything you would like to add, or do you think we've...
No, I just, I've been looking at a quick bit in the question and answer box, and I did forget to say that we actually uploaded the work and the rubric. So we gave specific prompts. We gave the rubric, the task description, and then the pieces of work. So I didn't mention rubric, and that was a great question that people have been asking.
Great, fantastic. Thank you. So we'll hand back over to Teresa now to facilitate some questions. Thanks everyone for listening.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Hayden and Elly. That was amazing as well. And yes, many questions. So we're going to do our best. Now, some of the questions were about the rubric, and I think you've answered that. So yes, the rubric was used to make judgment, and there was a few questions about then if you upload the assessment in GenAI, does that cause problems with plagiarism because the questions and answers are kind of in the system, or what do you do to overcome that, for example?
Yeah, my understanding is if you're talking about plagiarism detection software, the content uploaded into large language models is separate to that. So I don't think there's any bleed outside of them. They're hoarding their data, but they're hoarding it for them. It's not connected directly to the internet. So I don't think there's a huge issue from a plagiarism front, but that's just my understanding of it.
Great, thank you. Okay, so good question is, do you think it's related to the discipline area? So would this example be different if would you have different results if it were early childhood or ICT or construction, different kind of vocational area?
Yeah, my opinion now, Hayden, is that yes, it would be really different. And even the fact we, you know, how long it takes to get ethics and then do the actual work. This data is coming up to I was going to say 12 months old, might be a little less than that, Hayden. So I even think that if we were to redo this experiment now, and put that through, we haven't actually looked, as we didn't put in our ethics, and we would, you know, do a second stage data collection. But I wonder even now with the advances in the GenAI space, whether we would get the same findings. Hayden, you
yeah, for sure. No,
I
think you've nailed it. It's definitely content specific as well, beyond just this moment in time. It's really good at answering factual questions and identifying if students get those right or wrong. When it gets into nuanced, complex judgments on work that's a little bit more complicated, that's when it really starts going downhill a little bit. So if you've got a yes or no, black or white answer, the provision of feedback on that's a lot more clear. But if you've got something that's a little bit more tricky, then yeah, the nuance or the human element that's dependent on can cloud the waters, to say the least. So very content dependent. And I think there's quite a bit of research going on at the moment in this space. So if you've got a specific content area, there's a chance that somebody's run a very similar study to ours looking at it.
Great, thank you. Now, so that was a few questions about the study itself. Now, there's some kind of philosophical questions in there in the Q&A box, and I think what we'll do is try to group them together. But the main premise, so that everybody can have so Elly, Hayden, and Lenka can each have a perspective on this. I think what the gist of the questions is, how do we balance the need for students to be able to learn to use these tools, balance that with what industry expectations are, and not just thinking about industry now, but industry that they're going into when they're finished? How do we balance that need for using and developing the skills and capabilities to use the tools with that academic integrity issue, and also recognising that in the mix we have students with disabilities who it might actually help them to be able to, you know, overcome some barriers. It might be an enabler for them. So how do we balance all of these things? What is your advice? So what I'll do is I'll go to Lenka first, because I can see she's got a trigger finger on the mic there. She's ready. And then Hayden and Elly. Thanks, Lenka.
I was just twitching, but I'm ready to go.
Yes,
So I think there's a couple of questions in the one there, I guess. So I'll go to the first one about kind of balancing up the, you know, making sure students learn what they need to learn whilst also learning that how to use Gen AI. And it kind of touches a little bit on Hayden's shout out to the two-lane theory, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. But I think it's one thing that it does capture a lot. How it's implemented is different. Is there's things that we do to kind of facilitate learning, so assessments for learning, and then there are going to be things that we need to put in place, which are the assessments of learning. So the for learning things will be all of that stuff that we want to teach students, whether that is using it with AI or not, depending on what we want to teach them and what we want to develop. But then there'll be these critical points within a course or a discipline or a degree where we need to then kind of really check that they have actually learnt the thing that they need to learn. And so I don't think it needs to be an either or. You know, like I think sometimes we're like, well, if they use this, how do we know? I mean, maybe not all the students will learn it, but I mean, not all students learn equally anyway. But I think we really need to kind of balance that idea. As for how industry is wanting students to engage with this, I think as we were sort of chatting a little bit before the presentation started, I think in some ways we're kind of I don't want to use the thing about building the plane as we fly it, because everyone just always uses it, although I kind of just used it, so I apologize. But I think we don't really know. Like, I think a lot of industry saying, we want Gen AI ready graduates. And I think some industries really know what they mean. And I think some industries are just kind of saying it. And then there's everything in between. And so I think that bit there is going to sort of reveal itself in time. And lastly, is in terms of students with disability, I think these tools can really, really be a game changer for a lot of students with diverse needs in various ways. So I think that is a huge positive. I won't go into it in any detail, but I think that is a huge positive in kind of developing a teaching and learning experience for diverse student cohorts.
Thank you, Lenka. That's very comprehensive answer. Okay, so now Hayden.
Do you mind if I just add to it, if that's okay, Elly?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, the two-lane approach that I was referencing earlier and Lenka just alluded to, it's probably the best balancing of those two dimensions that I've seen, and it kind of balances them because it just goes, okay, well, we're going to just put them in different lanes. We're going to suggest that over here in lane 2, we've got AI literacy, we've got formative feedback or assessment as learning. Which is very different to our lane 1, which is our summative assessment or our assessment of learning, where we say our focus here is on verifiability and can we observe that you have met the learning intentions or the learning outcomes of your subject. So you just put everything else aside and you say assessment security in lane 1, we're going traditional pen and paper exams, we're going presentations, we're going placements with tick boxes for specific objectives, and that's where you've got 100% verifiability. You can't use AI to falsify your capabilities. And then on the other lane, it's just we're focusing on giving you feedback. That's the main priority of this type of assessment. We want to build your AI literacy, and we want to build your capability in these spaces.
Thanks, Hayden. Sorry, did I cut you off there? No,
not at all.
So I just wanted to say there are a few questions about VET in the Q&A box. I know that you're focusing here on a higher ed study. But some of what you've just described there also could be related to the vet context and anxiety about how do we deliver the skills for using GenAI whilst also maintaining authenticity and validity, etc., of our assessments. So thank you. Yes.
And Teresa, in relation to that, I suppose at Melbourne Poly, we have some of our units that encourage the use of AI in their assessments, and then some that definitely don't. And things where we're talking about health and safety and regulations working with children, we need to know that the student understands and knows that content and can put that into practice. So things with that, we are less open to the use of AI. Whereas like in some of Hayden's subjects in STEM and technology, if you're going to teach about it, you should be embracing and using it. So not that we are by any means experts in using AI and teaching about it with our students, but what I'm finding, they're using it anyway, even in the subjects, we all know, even in the subjects that they're not supposed to use it, they are using it. And I often find, unfortunately, it's the most vulnerable of our students that get caught, that perhaps aren't as clever with the use of it, or openly admit that they've used it when they're questioned. And so I have some real, ethical issues. Obviously, we need to monitor that, and we need to be ensuring that everybody we have that academic integrity. But sometimes I feel like it's the most vulnerable students that get caught either way, either not being able to use it well. So it's that equity. If we're actually promoting the AI literacy and giving everyone the same kinds of skills to be able to engage with it, perhaps that's something that will help in that area.
Thanks, Elly. Yes, so you've raised some questions there, or one of the issues which comes up quite frequently is about equity and how do we ensure that we do use it to that advantage, but also to make sure that we have equitable access and use. All right, so we did look. There's a bit of a question a bit of a theme in the Q&A box around keeping the curriculum current. And some of this relates to training packages in vocational education and training, but some of it is about what you do in that higher ed space too. So how do we keep up to date with this? And this came through in your study as well, Hayden and Elly. It's not just the teachers themselves had to be very much across to be able to use and deliver the skills. So what's your recommendation on trying to work together or work with industry to keep this curriculum current in terms of GenAI?
I think it's a bit of a nightmare. My understanding is it's not just increasing, the rate of change is increasing. So it's kind of like trying to catch lightning. You might do the best you can, but you don't really expect to ever be fully across it. Like the other day, I was just having a go at tinkering with some of the current models out there, and there was about 8 different current models that I'd never heard of. And so I think the idea that you would ever be on the cutting edge of this is a little bit of a non-starter, and a bit of a tricky expectation to set. It's probably more about having the fundamentals of use that are probably going to remain relatively stable as opposed to being completely up to date. And so that's where I'd suggest knowing how large language models work, knowing their strengths and knowing their weaknesses, and having a really good capacity to generate prompts. And there's some relatively good resources out there for guidelines on how you can start with a prompt and then alter, tweak, adjust until you get a range of different outputs, some of which you'll be happy with. But this is an emerging field. This is a knowledge space regarding prompt engineering and AI wrangling that's changing every day. So that's a really tricky question. What do you think, Elly and Lenka?
Personally, I agree with everything that you said. And in some ways, this comes a little bit down to a point that I also touched upon about the importance of developing those core competencies. And I sort of got this when I was talking to Professor Jason Lodge, who's one of the people who developed the assessment reform principles. And he was like, when I was young, I was forced to learn MS-DOS, and no one speaks about MS-DOS anymore. But it's kind of those foundational skills and those critical thinking skills and all of that that kind of then allow you to adjust and adapt. And you might not immediately know the technology, but you understand the concept of how to engage in something. And you're right, like there's constantly new AI tools coming out there, and the idea that we could know them all is impossible. But for the most part, unless you're like in a really technically kind of driven industry, most of the time what we're talking about is engaging with a chatbot in some way. And so I think just having that kind of critical faculty, which industry is still really kind of calling for, will be a huge, huge asset, I think.
Thanks, Lenka. Elly, anything to add to that?
I think just linking back to the critical thinking and the skills involved in that, I was just putting in the chat before, I've recently failed a number of assessments that used GenAI, and I didn't fail them because they used GenAI, because they still didn't actually understand the task or what it was asking them, or they couldn't actually interpret what AI had given them to go, that's not right. Or those words are not words that are commonly used. You know, when you're marking something and you've got to get a dictionary out because you've never heard of that word before, you can kind of go, I think they might have used AI here, but they've not passed because they've not understood or been able to apply it. So even though it's there and they're using it, it doesn't mean they're doing it well, but it also means it's not the answer. We don't have to throw all of our assessments out because, you know, we are still looking for critical thinking.
Thank you. So it sounds like we still need to go back to that very important human skill of critical thinking, whether we're using AI or whether you're assessing AI or whether you're helping others to use it ethically and appropriately. So yes, thank you. Now we're just about at time, and I noticed that there's a few questions in the box, in the chat box, or the Q&A box, just about the study that Elly and Hayden conducted, and I'm sure that we'd be able to get those questions to them in case you wanted to know more, or unless there is somewhere where people can read about your study. If you've got anything published on that, please let us know and we could send that out with the recording. And there were some questions about the two-lane approach and the resources that TEQSA have online, and so we have put those into the chat, but that we could also provide a link to that in our resources, I think, to assist, because there were quite a few questions about the two-lane approach. And I see link's not always working, so we'll make sure that we send all of that out with the recording. And I know that this is just going to be a moving feast for all of us, and I'm sure we'll have more to discuss on this as we continue along this journey of AI. So look, I really wanted to say a big thank you to Lenka from TEQSA and to Hayden and Elly from Melbourne Polytechnic for such an insightful and practical discussion today. It was amazing. And our next big event, which will be Evolving Digital Learning for Strategic Impact at TAFE Queensland with Adobe, will be on the 6th of August at 2 p.m. Thank you to the audience for your participation, and I hope to see some of you or all of you again on the 6th of August at 2 p.m. for the next TAFE Talks. Thank you, everybody.